I got married in 1964 at just 18 years old. If anyone had told me what was coming, I'd have laughed it off. Now, approaching 75, I feel like a different man. I've got lung cancer. Doctors say the outlook isn't bright, and these days, I'm confined to a wheelchair. As much as I've kept to myself, something about knowing that my time is running out makes me want to share this story. Maybe it'll mean something to others, especially those younger than me. I've got a lot of regrets, and if sharing them helps someone else, then it's worth it. When I think back to those early days, I'm almost surprised at my own optimism. I was young, full of life, and even though I didn't have much, I felt like I had all I needed in the world. I was just a kid who thought love would carry us through whatever life threw our way. My wife and I didn't have any grand plans. We were just trying to make it by. I worked in construction, taking on whatever jobs came my way, and she worked long hours cleaning rooms at a local hotel. We weren't wealthy by any stretch of the imagination, but we had each other. That was enough. We didn't have kids, and maybe that was a choice that haunted us more than we admitted at the time. Weekends were our sanctuary, just the two of us sharing quiet moments and trying to find joy in simple things. As I think back, I don't remember us ever fighting. I suppose there were probably disagreements, but nothing big enough to linger in my memory. She and I got along well. We had an ease between us that I used to take for granted. As time went on, I started making a bit more money. It wasn't a windfall, but it was enough for her to stop working, which I thought would make things easier for us. I figured that if she could stay home, maybe we'd find more time to spend together. But life doesn't always work the way you plan, and the long hours I worked to bring home that extra income started taking their toll. I'd be out late, arriving home exhausted, and little by little, I felt our marriage shift. What we had felt more like friendship than romance, and though I loved her, it was hard to ignore that something essential between us had started to fade. We were slipping into a sort of distant familiarity, and intimacy became a rare thing, almost a forgotten habit. I still remember one night, coming home later than usual. The house was quiet except for the soft hum of the radio in the living room. My wife was already in bed, but there was something about that night that made me pause. For a moment, I felt like an outsider in my own home, like I was standing at a distance watching my own life. But I brushed it off, telling myself that life was just busy, that we'd reconnect once things settled down. Then one day, I found an envelope in the mailbox with no return address. Inside was a single photograph, an old, weathered picture that looked as if it had been torn and mended over time. It was a photo of my wife and a man I didn't recognize, standing close, smiling. My heart raced as I tried to make sense of it. I told myself it was probably an innocent photo, maybe an old friend I'd never met. But then I flipped it over and saw a date written in faded ink, 1978, just a year before she had suddenly started asking me to take on extra work hours. She'd said it was so we could save for a future vacation, but we'd never taken one. The photo opened up a door in my mind that had long been locked. I began to wonder how well I actually knew my wife, and a feeling of unease crept in, the kind of quiet suspicion that gnaws at you when you're alone. That picture haunted me. I couldn't bring myself to confront her, so I slipped it into my pocket and carried it around for weeks, trying to figure out who that man was and what he'd meant to her. Then, one night, I stumbled upon her old keepsake box while searching for a pin in our dresser. Inside, along with the usual mementos, I found a letter, neatly folded and clearly cherished. It wasn't addressed to anyone in particular, but as I read it, I knew it wasn't for me. The words were intimate, loving, filled with a warmth I hadn't felt from her in years. Whoever had written it had meant a great deal to her, and though she kept it hidden, it was clear it had been a lifeline for her. For the first time, I realized that I might have only been one piece of her life. That envelope, that old photograph, and now this letter. It was like peeling back layers of a life I thought I knew. I was filled with questions, doubts, and anger. I wanted answers, but I didn't want to shatter what was left of the life we'd built. My health had started declining by then, and the exhaustion made it easier to ignore what was right in front of me. So, I buried it deep, as if that would somehow erase the hurt I felt. But the universe has a funny way of bringing things to light. Several years later, I was sorting through some old paperwork in the attic and stumbled upon a second envelope. Inside, There was a worn-out journal, its pages yellowed with age. I opened it and immediately recognized my wife's handwriting. It was full of dates, times, and places that didn't make sense. She'd been keeping track of something, someone, without ever telling me. Flipping through the journal, I realized she had been meeting this man for years, during the time I was working those long hours she had once urged me to take. My heart felt like it was being ripped apart. She'd built a secret life parallel to ours, filling it with memories that had nothing to do with me. She'd shared moments and emotions with someone else, while I had convinced myself that our growing distance was just a phase. I had been out there, breaking my back to make our life better, only to discover that she had spent that time building a world with someone else. The hardest part of it all was seeing how ordinary those entries were. They weren't filled with passion or anger, just simple notes about times and places, as if they'd become as routine as my own work hours. That hurt more than anything, realizing that she hadn't even considered ending things with me. It was as if our life together was just another job for her, one she clocked into when I was home, only to clock out of when I left. By the time I finally confronted her, I was already worn down. I wasn't looking for an apology. I just needed to understand. I showed her the journal, expecting denial or anger, but instead, she just looked at me, tired and defeated. She told me she had tried to find happiness in our marriage, but over the years, she had felt more like a caretaker than a partner. When she found that other person, it wasn't planned or dramatic. It was, in her words, an escape. I couldn't help but feel anger and sorrow all at once. Part of me wanted to throw everything away, to leave and never look back. But another part of me, the part that still saw her as the girl I married, couldn't. In the end, I stayed, but nothing was the same. We shared a home but little else. I watched as the years wore us down, two strangers passing time under the same roof, bound not by love, but by the shared memory of what we once were. One evening, after a grueling day on the job, I walked into the house expecting the usual routine. The smell of dinner wafted through the air, and the TV in the living room was tuned to a baseball game, just as I liked. My wife, Linda, knew how much I loved baseball back in those days. It was one of the few things that still gave me something to look forward to. She had a pot simmering on the stove, her back turned as she went about her business. We made small talk, just the usual pleasantries about work and the day, and I figured everything was normal. After we chatted, I headed down the hallway to our bedroom, ready to change out of my work clothes. But when I opened the door, something felt off. There, on my nightstand, was a small, brightly colored box. I squinted at it, trying to make sense of what I was seeing, and then my heart nearly stopped. It was a box of condoms. My mind started racing. I hadn't bought a box of condoms in years, not since my vasectomy, and certainly not for any reason I could think of now. I could feel my pulse throbbing in my temples, my body frozen between rage and disbelief. I walked back into the kitchen, box in hand, barely able to breathe. I held it up, demanding an explanation. Linda's face drained of color as her eyes darted between the box and me. For a moment, it looked like she might try to lie or make up a story, but then she broke. She couldn't hold back the tears and blurted out her confession. She admitted that she'd been unfaithful. She confessed that she had invited a coworker over, a man she'd been seeing in secret, and that he had been in our home, in our bed, on the nights I was working late. Each word struck me harder than the last, and I could feel the ground slipping from beneath me. She went on to tell me that she had forgotten to hide the box before I came home. She had been careless, a slip-up that revealed her betrayal in the most unforgivable way. And as if that wasn't enough, she went on to say that she had felt lonely for years, that she hadn't found me attractive in a long time, and that she had never enjoyed our intimacy. Those words broke me. I could barely see through my own tears, my vision blurred as she poured salt into wounds I hadn't known were there. I stood there, silent and stunned. I thought of all those years I'd spent working overtime, thinking I was building a life for the two of us. I thought of all the sacrifices, the countless nights I'd come home late only to find her asleep, thinking she understood why I worked so hard. But now it was all laid bare, and it felt like I'd been living a lie. She had taken every ounce of trust one had and crushed it. Unable to say a word, I turned and walked out, not knowing where I was going or if I'd ever return. That night was the beginning of the end. We divorced shortly afterward, putting an official end to the 19 years we had spent together. But the scars left behind didn't fade easily. In my 40s, I was a wreck. I felt like half a man, stripped of everything I thought I knew about myself. I had given my life to this woman, only to find out she had been seeking comfort elsewhere. The betrayal left me broken, questioning my worth and unsure of who I was. My self-esteem plummeted, and I sank into a depression that seemed bottomless. I felt unworthy of love, convinced that anyone I opened my heart to would end up hurting me just the same. My sadness turned to anger, and eventually, anger turned to numbness. I started drinking to dull the pain, finding solace at the bottom of a bottle. Alcohol became my new companion, filling the empty spaces my wife's betrayal had left behind. What started as a way to forget slowly grew into a dependency. Soon, I couldn't get through the day without a drink or 10. My nights were spent alone, drinking in silence, reliving the memories that haunted me. I'd think about all the ways I'd failed, all the things I'd done wrong. Every thought led me back to the same conclusion. I was not enough. My drinking spiraled out of control, and by my late 40s, I was what you'd call a full-fledged alcoholic. I had lost nearly everything that mattered. The man who had once worked tirelessly to provide, who had dedicated himself to building a life, was now nothing more than a shadow of his former self. It took me another 2 decades to get sober. By my 60s, I was worn down, scarred inside and out, but somehow I managed to find the strength to get clean. I don't know what finally pushed me to change. Maybe it was the realization that I had nothing left to lose. But even after I sobered up, the damage lingered. I tried to rebuild, but I had no idea who I was anymore. The betrayal had shattered my confidence, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was somehow to blame. I thought back to what Linda had said, the words that haunted me for years after we split. She had told me that I had never satisfied her, that she had felt lonely and unattracted for years. Those words left a scar deeper than I could have imagined. In those quiet, lonely moments, I began to wonder if I really was the problem. Sometimes I would catch myself thinking, maybe if I had been different, if I had been better, she wouldn't have strayed. Maybe I hadn't been good enough. Maybe I hadn't shown her enough love or affection. But those were thoughts I tried to drown out, telling myself I would never know the answers. I would go on with the doubts hanging over me like a storm cloud. Even as I tried to move on, I was still trapped in the past, caught in the endless cycle of what-ifs and maybes. Years passed, but I couldn't shake the shadow her betrayal cast over me. I became wary, distrusting, and never allowed myself to get close to anyone again. I wanted to love again, to find happiness, but I was too afraid of repeating the same mistakes. Every time I met someone, the same fears bubbled up, the same questions played in my head. What if I wasn't enough? What if history repeated itself? In the back of my mind, there was a cruel irony I couldn't ignore. All those years, I had thought I was doing right by her, working hard, providing, making sure we had everything we needed. I had been so sure that I was giving her a good life, only to find out I had been blind to the cracks in our marriage. Even today, I struggle to reconcile that feeling, that all my sacrifices had somehow pushed her away, that my love had somehow fallen short. It left a bitter taste that even time hasn't washed away. Looking back now, I know that my marriage and the betrayal that followed changed me forever. It took years of hurt, recovery, and soul-searching to understand that sometimes, no matter how much you give, people may still walk away. Sometimes, the reasons they give will cut you to your core, make you question everything, but in the end, you can only move forward. I have come to accept that I will never have all the answers I wanted. And while the wounds will always be there, I have learned to live with them, scars and all. As I settled into my later years, I started noticing the inevitable changes in my body. My skin began to wrinkle a bit, particularly on the backs of my legs, a stark reminder that time waits for no one. Still, I took pride in maintaining my figure for quite some time. I remember when I was with my first wife, during our intimate moments, I could have sworn she genuinely enjoyed it. I kept up the tough guy appearance throughout my 30s, often donning a bandana, which I learned was a particular turn-on for her. I was generous in our intimate life, always eager to please and ready to explore the passions we shared. I used cock rings to maintain my performance, ensuring that I could give my all during those moments. Yet, as the years slipped by, I started to wonder if sex mattered as much in old age. It was an unsettling thought, and I found myself wrestling with it. About 5 years ago, I decided to dip my toes back into the dating pool. My new partner and I found companionship in other ways. Our relationship wasn't particularly sexually active, but she assured me that there was nothing wrong with me. She loved me for who I was, not just for what I could do in bed. It felt refreshing, yet part of me missed the spark I once had. In a twist of fate that felt almost like a cruel joke, I got married again last year, filling me with a renewed sense of happiness and hope. We exchanged vows in a small ceremony filled with laughter and tears. However, shortly after our wedding, I received the devastating cancer diagnosis that would turn my world upside down. The news hit me like a freight train. Since then, I have lost a lot of energy, but my new wife has been my rock, the only one who keeps me going through these turbulent times. As I began chemotherapy, I felt the weight of the world pressing down on me. The future looked bleak, and there were days I couldn't shake the feeling of despair. I started to wonder about the lessons I wanted to leave behind. My mental clarity began to slip through my fingers like sand, and I knew I had to share what I had learned over the years before it was too late. With each passing day, I found myself reflecting more on my past, the good, the bad, and everything in between. It became apparent to me that relationships, even when they end, leave behind valuable lessons. As I contemplated my life, I felt compelled to write down my experiences, my failures and triumphs, my heartaches and joys, in hopes that someone could learn from them. I wanted to warn others about the dangers of neglecting intimacy and connection. When I lost my first wife, it wasn't just a romantic betrayal that crushed me. It was the slow unraveling of years spent together without communication. I hope to impart that wisdom, that love requires effort, that relationships need nurturing, and that sometimes we take the people we cherish the most for granted. But amid the shadows of my illness, something unexpected happened. One evening, while sifting through old photographs, I came across an image of my first wife. I hadn't thought about her in a long time, and memories flooded back, some painful, others sweet. Suddenly, I felt a mix of nostalgia and anger. I realized that for years, I had been so focused on my own pain that I had forgotten the moments of joy we shared. It sparked something within me, a fire I thought had long been extinguished. In a surprising twist, I decided to reach out to her, my first wife. I found her number tucked away in an old drawer and hesitated for a moment before dialing. To my shock, she answered. Our conversation began tentatively, filled with awkward pauses, but as we spoke, a strange sense of closure enveloped me. I learned she had gone through her own struggles and regrets after our divorce. She had faced her demons and had changed in ways I never thought possible. As we reminisced, we shared a few laughs and exchanged stories about our lives since the split. It was cathartic. I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. I could finally let go of the anger I had held onto for so long. I learned that we were both just humans, flawed and searching for meaning in a world that sometimes felt unforgiving. But there was an unexpected twist. During our conversation, she revealed that she had always regretted how things ended between us. As we delved deeper into our past, she mentioned a secret she had kept for years, a secret that could have changed everything. During our marriage, she had been battling her own demons, struggling with feelings of inadequacy and insecurity, which had pushed her to seek comfort elsewhere. I listened in shock as she recounted how she had never meant to hurt me. It was never about me, but rather her own internal battles. This unexpected revelation shook me to my core. I realized that my struggles had mirrored hers. We were both searching for validation and love in a world that often feels devoid of both. In a way, it was both heartbreaking and freeing to understand that we had both been victims of our circumstances. Now, as I face my final days, I hold on to the belief that life is about the connections we make. Even in loss, there is the potential for growth and understanding. My heart is heavy, but it is also full. I want everyone to understand that love can be messy, complicated, and sometimes even painful, but it is always worth pursuing. With my health continuing to decline, I may not have many days left. Yet, I find comfort in knowing that I have shared my story, my struggles and revelations. I hope it resonates with someone out there. If my experiences can help even one person navigate their own relationships, then my journey will have had meaning. Life may be fleeting, but love? Love endures beyond the pain and the heartaches. In this unexpected twist of fate, I learned that sometimes forgiveness and understanding can be the most powerful tools we have to heal not just ourselves, but the relationships we cherish. That is my final lesson, and I hope the world will remember it. As I prepare to close this chapter, I find solace in the idea that love can transcend even the deepest wounds. Who would have thought that a simple phone call could unravel a tapestry of regret and hope? That the act of reaching out could lead to healing, not just for me, but for the woman I once loved? My heart feels lighter knowing that our past, though marred by mistakes, can now be seen through a lens of empathy and understanding. In the end, my wish for everyone is to embrace love, to nurture it fiercely, and to never shy away from the hard conversations. Life is too short for regrets, and every moment we have is a chance to create something beautiful.